Where does wrestling reside? Who is wrestling? Is wrestling in the mind? Is wrestling in the soul? What is wrestling? Alright, sorry for the existential opening, but that is the topic of this episode. What is wrestling? Now, this seems like first day stuff for a wrestling channel, but the answer is not quite that simple. Now, if you've been watching a lot of wrestling lately, you'll notice, especially in Ring of Honor and NXT, fans chanting, "This is wrestling," from time to time. But if there's a need to point out that this is wrestling, well, that implies that there are many times on wrestling programming that we're not watching wrestling. You see, we're already getting meta. So there's the question, what is wrestling? Well, if you ask me, and if you've seen a previous video of mine, you'll know that I believe chain wrestling is one of the fundamental hallmarks of what makes wrestling truly great. And you may also notice that when crowds are chanting "This is wrestling" for wrestlers like Hideo Itami, Johnny Wrestling, or Kota Ibushi, it seems that they are doing a lot of chain at the time. And so many hardcore wrestling fans are most certainly in agreement that chain wrestling is one of the most defining characteristics of what truly makes up wrestling. Now, some would argue that wrestling is actually all about storytelling. They would argue that if you could get me invested and get me to believe in a moment, even though I know that wrestling is fake, well, that's what wrestling is really all about. Being able to tell a narrative through wrestling without any words is most certainly a highly coveted skill. After all, let's look at the first time The Shield and the Wyatts ever faced off. The crowd was electric before the match ever even began. And in the end, isn't that kind of excitement the exact thing you need to make wrestling great? Now, beyond what wrestling is, what about what wrestling isn't? First off, this is professional wrestling, which is loosely based on amateur wrestling. And in amateur wrestling, strikes are not allowed. So by that rationale, it does stand to reason that if a match comprises mostly of punches and kicks, then it's not really a wrestling match, now is it? And yet, going another step further, just because something is athletic doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrestling. Take, for example, acrobatic moves. There are some who actually disqualify this as being actual wrestling. Moonsaults, handsprings, tope suicida. Impressive, but some would argue that this has nothing to do with wrestling. I mean, come to think about it, isn't the point of wrestling to stay on the mat? And let's not forget cutting promos. There are purists out there who say that mic work has nothing to do with wrestling and actually doesn't even belong on the show. Much in the same way that people make the complaint that MTV doesn't actually play music anymore, some would say that a real wrestling show is supposed to be wall-to-wall matches with no filler in between. And also, let's not forget about those who feel hardcore wrestling has no place in the industry. Sure, sometimes it's easy to look at the extreme brutality of companies like CZW and say that this level of violence has no real skill involved. After all, anybody could get stabbed by a flaming light bulb. And is wrestling supposed to be real or fake? When a shoot breaks out, is that what real wrestling is all about? Or is the moment that wrestling becomes real also the moment that it stops being wrestling? Is kayfabe meant to be protected at all costs? So I guess when you boil it all down, one could make the argument that any of these one things alone doesn't equal wrestling by itself. But maybe that's the point. Maybe when they're all done together and at the right times and in the right way, maybe that's what wrestling truly is. It's hard to imagine a truly great match that has amazing chain but zero selling and zero storytelling. And theatricality may be misused, but I think you'd be hard pressed to say that The Undertaker and Jakara don't still know how to do it right. And while 450s, backflips, and swantons may not have anything to do with mat wrestling, it's still very clear that acts like Will Ospreay, Ricochet, and Jeff Hardy still know how to pack in the seats. And for every deterrent of hardcore wrestling, there are plenty of matches in the ECW that prove that occasionally wrestling can go to the extreme. And in the end, it's a really hard question to answer. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments what you think wrestling really is. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, this has been Dave Knows.